If you imagine David Cronenberg directing a version of Cinderella, you'll be somewhere in the ballpark of Emily Blitchfeld's The Ugly Stepsister.
I've lost my mind.
Written and directed by Amelie Blitchfeld. Apologies if I am butchering the pronunciation of that name. The Ugly Stepsister tells the story of Elvira, who is essentially the ugly stepsister from the classic fairy tale. The movie is from her point of view. The movie opens with Elvira and her mum and younger sister moving in with another family, the other family consisting of just the dad and the pretty sister. Some stuff happens, this and that, there's some financial worries. I won't go into too much details for spoilery reasons, but news comes down that the prince is looking for a new bride. He's going to host a ball where he will choose his new bride. So both sisters and every other eligible young lady in the area, in the town, country, province, whatever you would call it. Both Elvira and her stepsister are after the prince's love. In fact, the movie opens with Elvira reading the prince's published poems and having fantastical daydreams about being literally swept off her feet by him. But the movie's not really about the prince of the Cinderella story. This is about the ugly stepsister. This is about the lengths that Elvira and her mum go to in order to become beautiful enough and therefore worthy enough of the prince's love and affections and money. That's more or less the plot. Not going to say more about that for spoilery reasons. The early hype around this movie has kind of focused on the gore element, and while it is very, very gory at times, I think focusing on that actually does the film a little bit of a disservice. Yes, it's gory, but it's actually much more of an internal psychological horror drama, and I mean that in a good way. The actress in the lead role, whose name escapes me, I'll flash it on screen, she is brilliant in this. You can really see and feel the struggles that she's going through internally on her face. It really is a brilliant genre-topping performance from insert name here. The supporting cast as well, specifically the mum, also very, very, very good. I'm going to assume that this was a fairly low-budget movie. I believe it was the debut of the writer-director, but it doesn't look or feel like a cheap, low-budget debut movie. The period costumes look great. The makeup and the physical effects definitely don't look cheap. Similarly, the cinematography, especially the fantasy sequences, and more specifically the sound design, are all great. It doesn't look or feel or sound like a low-budget, cheap horror movie. It's definitely assured in its directing and its design. It feels like whatever money they did have, they spent very wisely. The score stood out at times, both good and bad. It kind of opens, and for most of the movie, there's kind of like a Stranger Thingsy 80s synthy vibe to the score, which for the most part does work quite well. It's a nice kind of juxtaposition between the period setting and the more modern, 80s synthy score. But then there's also times when it kind of like it darts to like a spaghetti westerny, like Tarantino-y homage type score, which is a little bit off-putting at times, but the 80s synth vibe element of the score works really well, but it does feel a little bit disjointed at times. So as mentioned, it is written and directed by a woman, and I think that's partly what gives this such a unique feel at times. There's elements to the movie where it focuses on the female gaze, for lack of a better phrase, and it's done quite graphically, but quite meaningfully. I think it doesn't feel overly grotesque or gratuitous, and I think if it was directed by a man, it would have just had a different feel to those scenes. So that's definitely something that I think is a strength of the movie, is that female perspective on this story. The pressure that young women in particular are put under to look a certain way, it's sadly just as relevant today as it was back in Cinderella times, which I don't actually know when is that set. Is it like the 1400s or the 1800s? I don't actually know. Anyway, hundreds of years ago is when it's fictionally set. The methods moved in the UZ might be more barbaric than today's plastic surgery, but it's still the underlying societal issue is still there. So The movie does quite a clever thing of commenting on that, but still keeping it in a kind of like genre horror movie setting. So it's again, for a debut film, it's very, very confident with its themes and how it deals with things like that. There's a line in the movie that really stood out to me that kind of encapsulates everything that the movie is trying to say. I'll read it off the screen here. The line is, "You're changing the outside to fit what you know is on the inside. It's what's on the inside that counts." Now, as I said, that might be a little bit on the nose, thematically wise, moral of the story wise, for lack of a better phrase, but, just because it's a little bit on the nose doesn't mean it's any less relevant. Now, even though I've downplayed the goriness of this movie, it's definitely an 18 rated movie. In the UK it's an 18, so I would imagine it's a rated R in the States, or NC-17, I'm not too sure. Anyway, UK ratings wise, it's definitely an 18. But none of the sex, nudity or violence feels overly gratuitous. It definitely serves the story and serves the characters. It's not gore for the sake of gore's sake. Looking at you, Terrifier. There's an end credit scene, so stick around for that. If it's not been made obvious yet, I actually really did enjoy this movie. I'm going to go with 7 out of 10 for The Ugly Stepsister. I was very pleasantly surprised by this. I went in expecting a fairly mindless gore fest, and what I got was actually a well thought out, well paced psychological body horror with a fair amount of gore that Cronenberg fans would be proud of. It would make a good double bill with The Substance, actually. The Ugly Stepsister and The Substance, that would be a good double bill. Thanks to Shudder, Strike Media and Vertigo Releasing for hooking me up with early access screener for this. The movie is already out in the States, I believe, and it comes out in the UK on April 25th, and then I think it's released on digital sometime in May. I'll put all of that info in the description below. That's us, folks. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.